Yeah, welcome, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the abridged code of Jewish law, chapter 42, and we're up to 18. So Siman Mem Beis, Sif Yud Ches, chapter 42, number 18. So we're discussing the laws of a meal. So the next one is, we'll say, as much as a halacha, just common courtesy, we'll say. Hanichlas the bias, when you go to someone's house, lo yamad tenili oichel lechol ad shiyam Elohim. Don't demand food until you offered some. So you don't just walk to someone's house and say, feed me. Although teenage kids are good at doing that when they come home, that's but you should wait till you offered something. And it's forbidden to join in a meal when there's not enough for the house, for the household. So if you know that there's people who don't have and they invite you, you have to give an excuse, something, it's probably not going to be, you're not going to make them feel too good if you say, I'm sorry, I can't eat at your house because you're penniless and I don't want to starve you to death. But you should make an excuse or something and not eat if you know they don't have enough. So much so, he says, Shazel Abba Gezel. This is like borderline, it's like similar to theft. It's almost like robbing them. Even though the host invited you, but since you know they don't have enough to eat, and you're literally taking food out of their mouths and their kids' mouths if you accept the invitation. This is a very serious sin, for lack of a better translation, for which teshuvah is very difficult. Of course, sometimes a person can sometimes get in such a situation without realizing. They don't know till they're already there. Then it's a little bit hard, but it's that's the story. Okay, I don't want to get too much into stories because this is a halacha shir, but it's the Sasover Rebbe before he was the Kosovo Rebbe. The Kosovo Rebbe, before he was famous, he was very poor. And he was so poor that at one stage the town had a little meeting. He wasn't invited. And they, based on this halacha, I mean, this is before Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was written, but this is taken from the big Shulchan Aruch. They forbade anyone to be his Shabbos guest. He liked to have guests, but there wasn't enough food. They were very poor and didn't have enough food. So no one was allowed to go. So he could never get a Shabbos guest. Then one day there was a man traveling, and they didn't quite make it to town before Shabbos, getting close to Shabbos, and they pulled the wagon over to the side, and the wagon driver decides he's going to spend Shabbos on the wagon, and the fellow who's being, the one who's being transported, he says, I'm going to run to this town I see ahead and see if I can. So by the time he gets there, everyone's finished davening, and the only person who was still there was the future Kosovo Rebbe, and he's there davening still, and you see someone come in, in weekday clothes. He's running in, and he says to him, "Do you have a place for Shabbos?" He says, "No, I don't." He says, "Come, be my guest." He was so relieved. He gets invited, and as he's they're walking home, he feels like he's being surrounded by other people, but he looks around, no one's there. And he keeps looking around, and his host said, "Is everything okay?" He said, "Like, do you feel like there's other people here?" He says, "Of course. Don't you know two malachim accompany us home from shul to where we eat? They're with us." And the fellow thinks to himself, "Wow, I never felt this before. He must be a big tzaddik or something." So he comes to the house, and the host apologizes. He says, "Look, I don't have enough wine to offer you to make kiddush as well. There's only enough for one kiddush. So do you mind going, fulfilling your obligation by listening to me make kiddush? So he says, of course. And he figures, anyway, never felt malachim walking home, angels walking home before. So he's quite happy to hear his kiddush. He makes very heartful, meaningful kiddush. And then they make hamotza in these two tiny rolls. And he starts to realize, he's looking around, and he realizes that his host is very poor. He's getting worried about taking food from him. And okay. So his wife brings out 3 plates, and on each plate is 1 bean. And they say, here's fish in honor of Shabbos. Fish l'kavod Shabbos. So right. So he takes the bean, he puts it in his mouth, and you know what? It tastes like fish. It tastes like filter fish and salmon and everything all mixed together. It's like incredible. He's enjoying this. He says, "This is such good fish." So he says, "Of course, it's Shabbos." All right. Then they bring out whilst clears the fish plates. She brings out 3 bowls, and each bowl has 1 bean in it. He says, "Soup l'kavod Shabbos." People joke about the story. He tried to eat the bean with a fork. They said, "Come on, don't you know you don't eat soup with a fork? You only use a spoon." But anyway, so he takes the bean, and it's like delicious, thick soup. It's like taste the vegetables and the matzah balls. It's like, oh wow. Anyway, they clear the plate, and now they clear the bowl, and now they bring him. Next plate has 3 beans. 3 beans.
Okay.
Says we got you have here chicken, kugel, another side dish, whatever it was, the kavod Shabbos for the honor of Shabbos. And he eats it, and he's like so full he can't even finish his plate. It's like so delicious, and it's so filling. And throughout the meal, they're singing Zmiris and they're saying Divrei Torah. It was just the most incredible Shabbos he ever had. And all of a sudden, the host says, "We better bench. It's time for Shacharis." He looks out the window and realizes this meal has lasted the entire night. So they bench and they run to shul for morning davening. And when he gets there, so there's people coming and they see, a guest. They say, "Oh, you must have come after davening last night." He says, "Yes." He says, did you have somewhere to eat?" He says, "Yeah, I went to this man here." They said, "Oh, so was there enough to eat?" He says, "No." They said, "There must have been a very short meal." He says, "You kidding? We just finished." He says, "There was enough to eat?" He says, "There was more than you can imagine." Right? So anyway, he ended up becoming the Kosovo Rebbe, and his beans had the taste of the man. That's how it. Most people, though, if they can only afford beans, a few beans to eat, we're not meant to, or even more than that, we're not meant to be their guest because we're stealing food out of their mouth. So those who just joined us, there's that one more person come from the waiting room, then we'll announce the place again. And okay, so chapter 42, number 19. Simon Mem Base Sif Yotes. Also, the says you're not meant to leave the place you ate until after you benched, till after you say the after blessing. But you shouldn't even in the middle of the meal go to another room to finish the meal there. Or you're going to go somewhere, another room, and you come back afterwards to finish the meal. You shouldn't even do that in the middle of the meal, ideally. Then we're not talking about going to the kitchen to get the next course, or if someone has to go to the bathroom or something. But during the meal, people should stay at the table eat the meal there, and bench, and then they go. But Phil laleches rak chutz lepischoi. Even just to walk out the door and return afterwards to finish the meal, we should try and avoid this. Okay, so that's ideal situation. Ideal situation is we don't leave the room during the meal. What if someone did? So now what? So let's see what happens. He did go out. He did leave the meal. This is irrelevant as to whether he finished the meal before he left, or whether he left and he's coming back to finish the meal. He doesn't have to make a second hamotzi. The fact that he walked out of the room, we're going to see how long and how far, but if someone went to a different room, it's not an interruption in the meal, and he doesn't have to make another blessing. The kivun shekavas dosa pas. Now this is because he's established his meal on bread. Even though he's changed his place. So even though he's changed his place, since he has based his meal revolves around the bread. Wherever he is like the one meal. However, you should be careful to eat a kazayas, or at least some bread, in the place where he's going to bench. That's by bread. Other foods is not the case. So we're going to see depends which type of other foods. So at the moment, we are speaking about a situation where someone is washing and they're making hamotzi, and the meal is based on bread. So he shouldn't leave where he is, shouldn't finish the meal somewhere else or have the meal and come back. But if he did, particularly if he had in mind, well, let's not talk about when he had in mind yet. If he went and he finished the meal somewhere else, he can continue the meal. Doesn't have to make a new blessing. Now, number 20. Im oichel machabura. He was eating with a group. The Yitzchok sasmem adash yasu lekan. And some of them left, but they have the intention of returning. Even if they all left except for one person, as long as there's one person from the original group still there, the group did not become dissolved. And therefore, when they return, the original status, the group has returned. That is not considered an interruption, right? In the previous one, we're talking about individual shouldn't leave. All right, so yeah, either he's eating by himself, or if you have a whole group there and one person leaves, he shouldn't leave. But if he did leave, it didn't interrupt the meal, didn't interrupt the sunnah. But if you have a group, if the group goes, that's it, it's gone. And if a person comes back, they have to make a new blessing. But as long as one person remains, at least one, then the group still exists. Okay, so that's if they left. Now, 21 is a slight twist. Im mishas birchas hamoitzi, I said lechas acha kach lebeis acha ligmo shams dosai. Levarach sham birchas mozin. Let's say a person had in mind when he made hamoitzi, when he started the meal, he had the intention he's going to finish his meal somewhere else and bench there. So sometimes, you have, like a sukkah hop type thing. You have a sukkah's meal, and you have the first course in one sukkah, and then you go to another sukkah, and the dessert, whatever it is in the final sukkah. You got a bench there. That might be example. Another example is maybe you started your meal at a kiddush in shul. There was a sit-down kiddush and you're eating a proper meal. Okay, at the moment I'm out washing. It could often, usually at a kiddush, you don't wash for bread. But let's keep it simple for the time being. They washed, they had a meal there, but he's going to go home and finish the meal, or whatever it happens to be. You know, his hosts for the meal start very late, and he's impatient, so he starts his meal at home and then goes, whatever happens to be. So he had intention when he made a motzi that although he's eating something, some of the meal in this house, he has intention, he's going to leave, continue the meal in a second location, and that's where he's going to bench. That's where he's going to say the Birchas Hamazon, the blessing after meals. Nahagin lahatir. The custom is to permit this. However, there's a condition. The tzarich lezar leechol gam sham l'chol pachas kazayis pas. You have to make sure you eat at least the kazayas. So it's probably slice or two of bread in the new place. And he says that you shouldn't do this, and like shouldn't make this your standard practice. It should only be if it's a sudas mitzvah. So it gives so an example might be like a bris. So you want to go and continue the meal at the celebration meal of the bris or something like that. A kiddush to a Shabbos Suda could also be considered Sudas mitzvah. So it's not something you should do ideally, but we don't always live in the ideal world. The Sudas mitzvah is fine, and sometimes we say we don't live in the ideal world. So there might be a time and a place. Sometimes someone knows they're running very late for work, so they might wash, start their breakfast, have a few, eat a few bites, they eat a kazais, and then they run out to the bus or something, and then they finish it in the office. Right, so they had intention. It's not a good habit to get into, but as an example of a time of need. Okay. Top base number 22. So let's say you're going to daven it in the middle of a meal. Sometimes happens that you realize the time you got to run out, but a common example might be at a wedding. You've washed, you've had the first course, and it's a good idea that they daven married before people have too many l'chaims at the wedding, or get overexhausted from the dancing, or people leave. Now, so you stopped, you washed, you started the meal, you've gone to daven. Now, when you return, you don't need to make a new hamotzi. You don't need to start the blessing all over again and start the meal all over again. Primarily because since you davened, you've also watched what your hands are doing. You didn't touch places or things that not meant to touch you in the meal. Likewise, if you doze off during the meal, okay, fall into a deep sleep. You actually go to sleep, then that's maybe deep sleep is not the right word. If you actually go to bed for the night and then you realize, then you got up and you decided you're going to eat a little bit more than something else. But a person dozed off, so a short nap. Now, even though you dozed off, ended up being a long time. Loy mikra hefsik. It's not called a hefsik. Again, always depends how long. If you sleep till the next day, then the meal is over. But someone had a nap. So normally, from the time you eat, we say a person has to. Well, really, they should bench. They should say the blessing after immediately. But if for some reason they didn't, then up to 72 minutes, we say you could still bench. After that, not that the food is fully digested, but it's sunk in the person's intestines, and it's become digested to the point that you can't bench on anymore. He's missed opportunity. So the same would apply here. So if he dozed off, as long as within those 72 minutes, he could bench. Yeah, David, you had a question?
Yeah, what if a person had the Mazonas crackers and he decided he wanted to, after that, he decided that he wanted to wash for bread? Does he have to say an al mechia, or is it included in the benching?
Um, so let's do the simple one first. Simple one first. It's mazonos hors d'oeuvres. It's a lead up to the meal that he's eating, and it's a type of food. So let's use an example. Let's say like the Frankenblanks. What they call them. The little hot dog things. In the pastry.
You
So they're
call them
eating them as
pig in a blanket. That's what
yeah, those things. So they're serving them before the formal meal, but it's like a lead up to the meal. And they're also like a side dish at the meal. Then for sure he doesn't have to say an after blessing and everything. It all goes together. If a person's having mazonos at a kiddush, let's say, and then he's going to go home and have the meal. This is like the other extreme, right? Then then he really should make, if he's eating the kazayas, he should really make a blessing and then start the meal from scratch. If he didn't and he started the meal, then he can go with his benching. But that should do. Now, in between, where do you draw the line? It's hard to say because a lot of it depends on the norms of the time and place. What's considered a heart of the meal, or it's So that was a very unfulfilling answer, wasn't it? So I sort of
Yeah,
left it in
I have an
about the
unbetween.
middle.
I have an unbetween. So I didn't want to take the time because I don't want to be late for the class. So my wife asked me if I wanted to wash and have toast. So I said no. So I came to the class. I've been having crackers and peanut butter, but now I see she's sitting here and she's eating this nice looking toasted rye bread with margarine.
Oh,
And I'm thinking, like to wash. I hear that I have the rabbi right here. And let me ask, should I say it al mechia?
well, I think in your case, you particularly had in mind that it shouldn't can be continuation of the meal because you're planning not to eat the
Right,
bread.
right.
So
Better al mechia.
yeah, and then wait a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So he's dozed off. There's no problem. He can still continue the meal. Likewise, if he interrupted for a non-mitzvah interruption, could go in, for example, he had to go to the bathroom. Okay. Nevertheless, he does need to wash his hands again because he's gone to the bathroom. He's touched places that are normally covered. He has to wash his hands again, but he doesn't have to make a new blessing. Why? Because he's taken his mind off his hands. Well, the bathroom for sure he touched things he wasn't meant to touch, but other things that he did, let's say when we said, maybe he had to go to the door, let someone in, he wasn't paying attention to his hands. Unless he guarded his hands. So let's go back to the example when you stop to daven. Normally people during davening don't touch, or at least they're paying attention not to touch things that they shouldn't, or placing their body normally covered. So that might not be a problem. But even though he has to wash again, he does not make a blessing on this washing. And as we said, he doesn't have to make a new hamotzi. Because hesech meaning when a person took his mind off, he wasn't concentrating on ensuring that his hands were clean for the meal, that doesn't require blessing. Only if he needs to actually wash for the meal. Okay. Just mention, I just said going to the bathroom. If a person urinates it, when they wash, they don't need to make a blessing. If they move their bowels, there's a dispute. So it's going to depend who you normally follow. It's different views whether you have to make a blessing or not. Okay, 23. Shkama Sadosoi. So a person, he's finished his meal. And he makes a decision. I'm going to bench. I'm going to say the after meal. Now, what happened was, we'll just use we'll make it made up example. So he had his peanut butter sandwich, and he's ready to bench. And all of a sudden, they bring in the steak. So he changes his mind. Now he wants to eat or drink some more. So it's a problem. And as this is the kitzur, this is the abbreviated code of Jewish law, we get an abbreviated bit of a cop-out. He says, there are many different factors in these laws. Therefore, a person should refrain. Don't eat the steak. Rather, once he's made the decision, meal over, I'm going to bench, you should bench. Of course, it makes it problematic if you're going to eat after benching, because you can't put yourself in a blessing, in a situation just to make a blessing that you might not need to. So you'd have to wait a little bit. This is why, for an example, a practical example of this, it's not exactly changing the mind, but it's a similar idea, is on Shavuos. So we have a custom to have dairy. But on Yom Tov, you're also meant to have meat. So look, there's different communities do different things. There are certain communities that, just have a dairy meal and different things. And there's some communities, so in Chabad, generally the custom is you have a dairy kiddush. Then you make the after blessings and you wait, and then you wash and you have the meal. But there are certain communities where they have a full dairy meal and a full meat meal. It means they wash, have a dairy proper meal, they bench, and then afterwards they wash and they have a full meat. Now, you can't bench in order to wash, right? You can't have meat and milk in the same meal, so you have to bench in between. But if you're planning to have another meal right afterwards or very soon afterwards, well, you can't bench to have another meal that you're planning to do, because it's not real benching, So they go for a walk around the block or something to make a break. It gets into this situation. All right. That's chapter 42. Any questions? Okay.
So you're saying that they don't bench after the first dairy
Well, they
meal?
do bench, but then they go for a walk around the block to make
Oh,
a proper break. It's actually like
uh-huh.
leave the house and it's so there's a shul here. It's I was about to make the joke and say the shul I don't daven in, but I actually daven there quite a lot, but not on Yom Tov, not on Shavuos. So they because there's custom to stay up the whole night, so they daven at dawn. Well, at sunrise, not dawn. Right, daven b'sikin, and then people have their dairy meal. They wash, they have a whole meal, but then by 8 o'clock they're gone to bed. So they get up at 2, And then they wash and they have a meat meal. So that for sure is not a problem. That's a nice break and a sleep in between. It's not a, you know.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I saw something very similar to what you're talking about. This was on the beach in Miami during Lag Bomer. They were, there's a lot of barbecuing going on, at that point, and a lot of chicken was made. They made, chicken wings and all this other stuff. And of course, there's a lot of Israeli people there, and all kind. It's a mixed multitude basically. Anyway, the food was made, and everybody, helps themselves, and then they thought the meal was done. They thought it was over with just the chicken wings. So I see people, praying, they're benching, and then all of a sudden the steaks come out. you know, they start bringing out steaks only about maybe a half an hour later, an hour later. But I was wondering, if there's a similar situation that you're talking about, because
Yeah.
it's
So if a person had made up their mind to bench already, they probably should bench. But it sounds like if it was like a half an hour later, people benched and there was a gap, and then it was something unexpected. So that could be a new meal, and not necessarily you have to wash for the steak
yeah,
afterwards. It's
because it was about an hour afterwards. It was an hour afterwards after I saw.
yeah. And now breaking a meal is it's its own issue.
Yep.
Okay. So now we're gonna sort of get to a little bit what touching a little bit on what David asked before, but other issues as well. Siman Men Gimel, chapter 43. Hilchas brachas of the varm she'oichel v'shoisim b'soicha suda. Laws about the blessings of the things that you eat and drink during the meal. So, unexpected things or different, we'll say specialty foods. So we'll see. We'll get some examples as we go through. Aleph, number one. Kama she'oichel b'soicha suda midvarim she'gilim la'achla b'soicha suda this boy. Anything that you eat during a meal, which is the norm to eat during the meal to satisfy your hunger. Now, again, we're getting examples here, but it's possible this type of thing could change from time to time, place to place, because there might be certain foods that are perfectly normal to eat in a meal in certain cultures that in other places would never eat it during a meal. But let's stick to the simple things. So it's food that is normally served as the meal. It's meal food. Going for example, basa, meat, dogim, fish, mine, lifton, types of dips and different things. Daisa, mine, levivois, or a person has a porridge or pancakes. A filled davarm she'oichem lechem. Even things that are not normally eaten with bread, but they eat during the meal. Kolam ein tzrichem bracha lo lifneihem lo chareim. They don't need their own blessing before and their own blessing afterwards. Now, if you eat them outside the meal, of course they do. Person has the steak, let's use an example, is just eating a steak. He has to make a blessing before and a blessing afterwards. But if he's eating it in the meal, he washed, he made hamotzi, he's going to say the birchas hamazon, the full benching afterwards. And one of the things that's served during the meal is the steak. He doesn't need to make a blessing. It's included in the blessings before and after the meal. Why? Because he's eating them, A, because it's to satisfy his hunger, and B, they are things that are included as part of the meal. And all parts of the meal, all different courses of the meal are bundled together with the bread, because that is the cornerstone of the meal. And therefore, all food, meal food they eat during the meal, you have fulfilled the obligation to bless before by making the hamotzi at the beginning of the meal, and you fulfill your obligation to bless afterwards by the benching the berachos hamazon after the meal. Now, even if it's food sent to you from another house, right? Which is, in other words, you didn't expect it. It wasn't like yes, I'm gonna wash, I'm gonna eat steak now with my meal. No, you thought you're just gonna have a hot dog, and next door brought around some steaks, totally unexpected. But since it's still during the meal and it's meal food, you don't need to make a new blessing on them. Because generally speaking, when a person starts the meal, they have in mind that their blessings of the meal are going to go on whatever food happens to come his way for him to eat. So he doesn't need to make a new blessing. So let's just summarize that. So anything that's normally part of the meal, it's a type of food that's part of the meal, normally meal food, and it's to satisfy. So it doesn't require its own blessing during the meal. Base, number 2. So before we get into exceptions, we're continuing with things that are part of the meal. Likewise, you don't need to make a separate blessing on any beverages, any drinks. Because drink is also part of the meal. You're gonna have some juice, you're gonna have some water, you're gonna have alachaim. That's normally part of the meal. Why? Because it's not common to have a meal without drinking something. But one exception, ma'ala yayin, on wine. The fish yayin hu davachoshev, because wine is considered a special, a important drink. So nowadays, most of the time we have wine at a meal. It's Shabbos, Yontiv, and we already made the blessing of the wine. We made Kiddush. But let's just say, a person, he makes a motzi, and he's having his whatever he's having. We've been saying steak till now, so let's keep the steak going. And then he decides he's going to open a bottle of wine. Or even if from the beginning of the meal he had intention that he's going to open a bottle of wine during the meal. The wine, he has to make its own blessing. What makes the wine so special? So in the brackets, he says, because in many places, the wine gets its own blessing. Even when you don't necessarily actually want to drink it. Could go in, for example, Kiddush and Havdalah. You have Kiddush right before the Shabbos meal. You have Havdalah right before Malav Malka. Not always, sometimes there's a gap, but you potentially. And, this isn't wine. The Kiddush is not necessarily you're planning to drink a cup of wine now. You're drinking it for the sake of Kiddush. And yet it's such an important object that it gets its own blessing. So since it's such an important beverage, we have to make a blessing on wine, even in the middle of a meal. So if you had orange juice in the middle of a meal, it doesn't require its own blessing. The blessings of the meal exempt the orange juice or the water or whatever for having a dairy meal, the glass of milk. But here, wine requires its own blessing even in the middle of the meal. Now, if a person made a blessing on wine before he washed for the meal, so either a Shabbos, it was Kiddush, Yontiv, or sometimes people just serve drinks before a meal. And he had in mind when he made the blessing of the wine that he's going to drink more wine, or at least might drink more wine during the meal. Or he normally has some wine during the meal. He didn't have intention anything, but it's the norm for him to drink wine during the meal. Then he doesn't need to make a new bracha during the meal. Nifta bracha shebarach lefnei suda, because the blessing he made before the meal is good enough. So that's actual wine. So now he's speaking about yain saraf. Yain saraf, he's meaning whiskey. It means strong liquor, but in this case, in that part of the world. But dinasenu, he says, in our countries, the ein derech lishtos tom b'seichasuda. You don't normally, in the middle of your lunch, open up a bottle of whiskey and start, having a few cups. So have a half sofik imhu b'chal suda loy. So therefore, it's a doubt. It's not clear. Should you make a blessing on it or not? Now, again, this is what I'm saying. It depends on. This could change depending on the time and place. So, for an example, I'm not saying now necessarily, but I'm sure in the either it is the case or there were times, let's say in Russia, maybe to have vodka in a meal was the norm. So therefore, it's expected to be there, and they certainly don't have to make a new blessing on it during the meal because the hamotzi and the bread fulfills the obligation of a blessing for everything in the meal. But perhaps in Phoenix, people don't normally have vodka during a meal. It's only at special occasions, whatever it is. So therefore, they probably would have to make a blessing. It's not expected to be during the meal. Now, a Shabbos meal, people are expecting maybe, a lot of people have a custom to have a l'chaim after fish. So in that case, they are expecting. They were planning when they had the meal. I'm going to have some whiskey or vodka or whatever they're making l'chaim on, some wine or arak, whatever happens to be. So they're intending this is going to be part of the meal. So therefore, they don't need to make another blessing. But your average Tuesday lunch, most people aren't planning to have a strong liquor, so it puts them in a doubt. And therefore, if you had intention, you're planning, like Shabbos, you're planning to have a l'chaim after fish. So what should you do? Have a little bit after you wash your hands. Means during the meal, after you made a mitzvah. Sorry, before. He's suggesting you should have a little bit before you wash for the meal. The Hainapochs Mikazayas, Vivarach Alav, and you make the blessing on it. And you have in mind what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink during the meal. But if you didn't do that, he says then you should make a blessing on a candy or something, which is the same blessing as the whiskey, and have in mind that. Some people, what they do is they dunk their challah, they dunk their bread into the whiskey. That way they, at least once, so it's eaten with the bread. But there's some people who question this. So bottom line is, I think a lot of this depends, or I think the reality is a lot of this depends on the time and place. What's the norm? What's the norm? So if it's something that you intended to drink, or was the norm to drink, it's so again, let's talk about a wedding meal. It doesn't have to be a wedding meal, but extreme cases make it more black and white. It's easier to. So people are expecting probably to have a l'chaim during the meal, so they don't need to make a new blessing. Wine, yes, because the wine has its own cheshivas, its own importance. But other drinks, other alcoholic beverages, not necessarily. No, you're expecting to drink it during the meal. It's part of the meal. But if someone doesn't normally drink, and they don't normally have strong liquor at lunch, and this lunchtime they are for whatever reason, then they should try and have a little bit before, make a blessing, or make a blessing on something else. Okay, so that's drinks. So now we said all food. So we had some people join us during that. So we're chapter 43. number 3. So we said all foods that are meal food. So it's something you eat to satisfy your hunger. It's part of the meal. All of that is included in the blessing we make the Hamoitzi beginning of the meal and the Birchas Hamazon, the benching at the end of the meal, the grace after meals. But what about other foods? So number 3. You want to eat fruit without bread. So if you eat it with bread, we'll talk about that afterwards. But you want to eat a piece of fruit without bread. Now, since fruit is not really the main part of the meal, therefore, even if it was on the table before you make hamoitzi, the kol mokim nevertheless, the blessing on the bread, the hamoitzi does not exempt the fruit. And therefore, you have to make a blessing before you eat the fruit. So, for an example, there's some people, they have a custom after they have fish on Shabbos, they eat some apple. So they would have to make a ha'etz on the apple. But that's only the before bracha. Ava bracha achroina einon tzrichen. But after blessing, they don't need to make. Why? Ki niftarim birchas hamazon. The benching includes them. Now, that's if you're eating it without bread. Let's say you're going to have it with bread. You want to have the fruit with bread. So you like putting blueberries on your blueberry sandwich, say. Then you don't need to make a new blessing. Because since you're eating it with the bread, they have become secondary. They become part of the bread. Now you're going to eat some of it with bread and some of it without bread. So what do you do? You eat some without the bread first and make a blessing over it. And afterwards you can eat some with the bread, because you don't want to put yourself in a question, do I need to make a bracha or not? However, if someone ate some with bread first and then afterwards without bread, now he's in a situation where we're not sure whether he should make a blessing. So in practicality, when in doubt, do without. So whenever you're in a situation you're not sure if you make a blessing, you don't make a blessing. But he's put himself in a situation. Okay. So that's the other extreme. So one extreme is things like meat and fish, and that's part of a meal. And then we have fruit, which is not part of the meal. Now we're going to have in between. Some people eat between courses things that increase appetite. Could go in, for example, zayis maluch, pickled olives, the moini maluchim, pickled lemons. I gotta say, personally, I don't think I've ever seen a pickled lemon, but I guess some people eat them. Snoin or radishes, kedom and the like. So, since they are foods that are eaten in order to develop the appetite, they're also considered part of the meal. Because through eating them, you're going to eat more, or at least enjoy what you're eating more. And therefore, now you don't have, you don't need to make a new blessing. We'll just digest a little bit. to speak about dessert. Right. So over here, we're not really going to discuss dessert. We're going to discuss eating cake and different things during the meal. And he's going to say if you're just eating it for enjoyment, there's a question. So I guess that's touching on the dessert. But if you just bring something out for dessert, and it's not really part of the meal. In other words, the satisfying your hunger part of the meal is over. I mean, the food, your sustenance is over. It's just dessert. Question is, do you make a blessing on the dessert? In other words, is it part of the meal or not? So do you need to make a blessing before? So most of the older works, meaning let's say the Shulchan Aruch, the big Shulchan Aruch, the Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, they seem to rule that dessert requires its own blessing. I'll just share a story, and it's not a story now to, what is the story to illustrate the halachic point? So the Mishnah Brura, so the Chofetz Chaim, and he wrote a halachic work called the Mishnah Brura. He also writes that you have to make a blessing on dessert. So he lived a very long time. He lived a long life, the Chofetz Chaim. So when he was older, so quite a few years after Mishnah Brura came out, he was once seen eating dessert without making a blessing beforehand. So one of his students asked him, respectfully, not to start up, but they're curious, they wanted to learn. And they said, you rule that you have to make a blessing on dessert, and we see that you're not making a blessing on dessert. So how come? So he answered them, he says, when I wrote the Mishnah Brura, it wasn't the norm that people had dessert. So it's not considered part of the meal. He says nowadays it's the norm. People generally have some dessert. So I don't know if that was just a Shabbos Suda or was regular meals, but he says it's a normal thing people eat dessert. So therefore today it's considered part of the meal and no blessings required. So even those authorities who ruled in the past that you do need to make a blessing of dessert, not necessarily would they rule the same way today. Also, in that story, I'm not sure what he ate. Because let's say, for example, it was a piece of cake. So cake is more likely to be part of the meal than, let's say, I don't know, chocolate-covered raisins, let's just say. Right? Because, a cake is breadish, sort of bread-like, while something that's more just a sweet. So even if you're going to say that you don't make a blessing on dessert, it could also depend on what dessert is. So I know people prefer to come to a halacha class and get a clear answer, exactly what you're meant to do. That's why they want to learn halacha. But it's a area that's not so clear. So what do people do practically? So different communities do different things. There are some communities that bench before dessert. They always bench before dessert, and then afterwards have dessert. Now that solves some problems. See, this is one of the issues that whatever you do, I'm not, maybe not a polite way to describe it, but it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Whatever you do is going to make a problem. So benching beforehand, before dessert, certainly makes it very clear you have to make a blessing on the food you're eating for dessert. However, it also creates a problem because if you didn't actually need to make a blessing on that during the meal, and you benched with the intention to force yourself to make the blessing, then perhaps it's put you in a in a situation where you're making a blessing for nothing. But still, that's one option. Another option, when I was in Masifta, I was in high school, I boarded. There was not a yeshiva high school in the state where I lived, and I boarded in another state. And one of the family I stayed with the first year, he used to eat his dessert with challah. So he would like take a spoon of ice cream and put it in his mouth together with a bite of challah. And then it becomes, like we said before, how it's become secondary to the bread. Now that certainly is probably the best halachic out, but most people don't enjoy the ice cream that way. It's quite possibly a waste of good ice cream and a waste of a good challah. Imagine taking a good crispy sourdough and putting chocolate ice cream on it. It doesn't do justice to either of them. So it may not be the choice option.
It's better than no ice cream at all.
Yes, better than ice cream at all, right? That could be another way. Don't eat dessert, but that's it's. And I think practically it depends really what the dessert is. I think if you're having anything that's meal-like, a cake, some type of slices, something that has, even though it's sweet, you probably don't need to make a blessing on it. If you're, let's say the Shabbos meal, for example, where it's a norm to have dessert as part of the meal. If it's something like an ice cream or something that that really is just, it's just for fun, so to speak. That kind of dessert is just for fun. It's for enjoyment. In other words, it's not really not meal food at all. Then probably needs its own blessing. So that's probably to do practical. Hopefully, I didn't make that more complicated than it needed to be. But I think sometimes by getting seeing all the issues helps you decide where to draw the line. Just to give an example, because we're going to be speaking about different blessings, an example of where to draw the line. So let's say, for an example, there is a dispute about chocolate. What's the blessing on chocolate? Now, the truth is, the chocolate we eat today, with all the extra ingredients, there's actually not a lot of cacao, whatever, actually in the chocolate, most chocolates. But there is an opinion that chocolate should be ha'etz. Generally, we always say shahakol. Say shahakol, it's like a candy, but there is an opinion to ha'etz because that's how you eat the bean, the fruit of that tree. You don't eat it straight. You turn it into chocolate. So there's an opinion that's how you eat it. We don't follow that opinion. We say shahakol on chocolate. But let's say you have a chocolate-covered almond. So what's the main one? What's the main part of it? Is it the almond, so the blessings are 8, or is the main thing the chocolate? In which case you would say shahakol. But in this case, when it comes to chocolate-covered almond, there's an opinion that ha'etz belongs on the chocolate anyway, so you don't have to worry about this question. You can just make ha'etz. Right? So some of these things, just using an example of how it becomes borderline when you understand the bigger picture, it helps you make decisions.
They usually give us some, and then we'll think about it.
Chocolate-covered almonds?
Yeah.
Sounds good, huh?
Yeah.
Mr. Shem will have an in-person get-together. I know Rabbi Smith, in theory, would like to make a Shabbaton one day for everyone that comes. It's just logistics, but in concept. So, maybe we'll have one day, God willing. All right. Any questions before we finish up? No? In that case, enjoy your meals and chocolate-covered almonds. Have a wonderful week. And we'll see everyone next week and have a good Shabbos.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You too.
Well, take care.
Thank you.